Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this main part of this, I would say, about this symposium, namely the lecture of prize winner of 2023 prize, Stockholm Prize in Criminology. My name is Jerzy Sarnecki. I am a retired professor of criminology here in Stockholm, and I am co-chair of the independent international jury for Stockholm Prize in Criminology. Let me present to you the chairman of Stockholm Prize in Criminology Foundation, Ann Ramberg. Thank you, Ann. And now, as you probably know, the rules of this prize is that the prize is decided by the independent international jury. And I will present now the present members of the jury and the members who couldn't attend this session. So let me start with Professor Susanne Karlstedt from Australia and Germany. Professor Candice Kushner from US and Canada. Sorry. Professor Peter Neyrud from UK and Sweden. Professor Friedrich Lösel from Germany and UK. Where is Friedrich? Okay. Professor Emil Pływaczewski from Poland. Unfortunately, Professor Hiroshi Suzumi from Japan is not here at the moment, as you can see anyhow. Professor David Weisbrod from Israel and United States. And two additional members of the jury who were not able to attend this year's conference. Beatriz Abigina from Spain and Uruguay. And Tiuha Malova, we call him Tia, that's why I have to pronounce all his name, from South Africa and the United States.
Go Tia.
And now let me introduce to you my colleague and co-chair, Professor Lawrence Sherman, who is also scientific executive of Metropolitan Police in London. Please, Larry, come forward, and Larry is going to present our prize winner.
Thank you, Jerzy. Our prize winner, as you know, Beatriz Magaloni, is the Graham H. Stewart Professor of International Relations at Stanford. We've never had a political scientist win this prize before, and certainly not a professor of international relations, which I'm glad to see is very broadly understood at the University in California, where she has been working since 2011 at the Poverty, Violence, and Governance Lab within the Friedman Spogli Institute for International Studies. And this emphasis on poverty, violence, and governance clearly has a lot to do with the reasons she was chosen to be the 30th winner of the Stockholm Prize in Criminology, since the first prizes were awarded in 2006. She was born and educated in Mexico, and originally studied law at the Autonomous Institute of Technology of Mexico, or ITEM, after which she had a transformative opportunity to go to Duke University to take her PhD in political science. And with her interests in the very important conditions of governance as a political issue in Mexico tied up with violence and poverty, she has relentlessly pursued those themes, first with her book, Voting for Autocracy, Hegemonic Party Survival and Its Demise in Mexico, a context for the major study of the changing rules of criminal procedure that actually were identified in relation to a sharp decline in police torture to obtain confessions. You'll hear more about that from her and learn more if you read her many articles in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, other top journals, and most recently, I'm very pleased to say, with a very interesting experiment on body-worn cameras published in the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing. It's open access. You can read it right now by putting it into Google. But instead, don't do that. Listen to our prize speaker, and Yurtzi and I will clear out to give her the stage. Please welcome Professor Beatriz Magaloni.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking everyone for being here to listen to my lecture. And I want to especially thank the members of the jury for selecting and recognizing my work, and also the foundation that makes this award possible. I'm going to be talking about my work in Mexico and Brazil. And the title of my lecture is The Challenges of Creating More Humane and Equitable Policing. So the state monopoly of violence is often linked to the emergence of order, which is necessary to foster economic development. This monopoly of violence also creates the conditions where vigilantism and frontier justice become unnecessary to deter crime. But the state's main coercive arm, the police, can be predatory, turning or allowing violence against their citizens or becoming an extension of criminality rather than a solution. Internationally, police abusive behavior has increased salience in recent years. We read the newspapers and we hear about police violence in the United States and how much that really has sparked protests all over the world. We read about police violence in Brazil. Colombia recently had this wave of protests where police used excessive use of force, even sexual violence. In the Philippines, where the shoot to kill policies have led to innumerable human rights abuses. In Mexico, where the UN rapporteur in 2015 said that torture was a generalized practice in the country, Nigeria, and many other countries. So police violence and abuse is really very common and endemic in the world. We might not be so surprised that this happens in autocracies, but what is really more surprising is that it does take place in democratic societies. And this is puzzling, because democracies should be, at least the literature in political science links democracy to restrictions to violations of human rights. It is believed that the existence of checks and balances restrains police and human rights abuses, and it's also believed that mass accountability to voters should restrain violence. But the fact is that democracies continue to violate human rights, despite all these institutions that are supposed to restrain the state from using coercion against its citizens. So the main research questions of my work are: what are the challenges of creating more humane and equitable policing? What are the institutional, organizational, and societal obstacles to creating policing based on the rule of law? What works and does not work to constrain police abuse? Illegal arrests, the fabrication of evidence, torture, and excessive and illegitimate use of lethal force. I examine these questions in the context of Mexico and Brazil. These are murals that are in Mexico City Supreme Court today that were commissioned to Rafael Cauduro. And the murals depict all the history of state abuse that has occurred in Mexico during its autocratic era. For example, the massacre of students in 1968, leading to incarceration of prisoners, political prisoners. But what is really most striking in these murals is the depiction of torture that is used in regular criminal trials. And this is, in my view, a call within the Supreme Court for no more injustices and abuse of power. But the road to that has been really hard. The extreme cruelty of torture is fundamentally incompatible with the principles of human dignity and respect for life. Torture undermines the core values of justice and the rule of law and is unequivocally prohibited by international human rights law. Moreover, torture lacks justification. Information obtained through torture often leads to false or misleading intelligence. And despite this, as I just mentioned, the UN General Rapporteur stated that torture remained a generalized practice in Mexico. This was in 2015. Torture in Mexico, in regular criminal trials, we're not talking about torture against political prisoners during the authoritarian era, has been used as a method of criminal investigation. This is the title of a paper I published recently in Mexico. During a long time, the Mexican Supreme Court, with its jurisdiction and decisions, jurisprudence and decisions, endorsed torture and other violations of due process. And here I cite two decisions of the court. One of them saying the verification of traces of physical maltreatment by the defendant during detention does not invalidate a confession if it is corroborated by other evidence in the file. Another decision says if a defendant were to try to change his statement before a judge, this statement given to the public minister and the police should be given more weight because it had been more spontaneous. With these decisions, the court endorsed judicial torture throughout the years. I wrote this paper titled Institutionalized Police Brutality, Torture, and the Militarization of Security, and the inquisitorial and the reform of inquisitorial justice in Mexico with my graduate student, Luis Rodriguez, that was published in the American Political Science Review. And there we argue that two factors shape the incidence of torture. One is weak procedural protections and lack of judicial checks on police and prosecutors. Mexico had an inquisitorial criminal justice system until 2008, when there was a very important constitutional reform. This inquisitorial criminal justice is very prone to produce abuses because it has very weak institutional checks on law enforcement. The second factor that we highlight in that paper are security policies and the militarization of policing, leading to more torture. Mexico in 2006 began a against drug trafficking organizations with the deployment of the armed forces throughout the country to combat drug cartels and arrest their leaders. These security policies, I have shown in other work, have been counterproductive, and they have led to massive increases in violence, the fragmentation of drug cartels, and the incidence of more turf wars among cartels. In addition, as I will show, they have also produced a very significant increase in torture. These inquisitorial systems were reformed in continental Europe at the end of the late 18th century, but Latin America retained these colonial institutions until very recently. Really, until the 1990s and 2000s, the region began to reform these inquisitorial institutions inherited from the Portuguese and the Spanish colonial times. All of these countries that I cite there, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and Venezuela and Peru, adopted these reforms of the inquisitorial criminal justice system. And despite the importance of these reforms, there has been very little scientific analysis of their implications. So my work has done that for the case of Mexico. Just to try to explain very quickly how the inquisitorial criminal justice system works, I'm going to give an example of when I was a lawyer in Mexico of the way criminal trials happen. So normally the accused were behind bars. Often there was a glass window with the inherents with the accused behind those windows, so they barely could hear. The judge was never present in the trial, and there was a secretary, usually a woman, typing in a mechanical typewriter with the prosecutor leading the trial. The judge never came out, and basically the decision was made at the end on the basis of a written dossier. But the practice of the system implied that although there was supposed to be a presumed innocence, accused were presumed guilty and they have to prove their innocence. In reality, all the decision was based on what happened at the moment of the arrest, when police capture a suspect, normally torture them, and they wrote what supposed happened. And that was basically judges corroborated every time whatever the police said happened. So with the criminal justice reform, these features changed significantly. Now we have oral trials. There is also a jury. Judges have to be present in the trials. And there is a very important reform that appointed 3 judges, one who controls the phase of investigation. So now the police has more checks and balances during that phase. Another judge who presides the trial, and the last one who oversees the execution of the sentence. And importantly, in the Constitution, there is a written statement that confessions are inadmissible when they are obtained through torture and without the presence of a defense attorney. So to study torture, obviously, it is very difficult to study torture because this happens really in hidden places, right? In the basements of clandestine detention centers or basements of police departments. So I was able to use this very large survey of the prison population in Mexico that asked very many questions about how prisoners live in prison, their history, and whether they came back from prison or not. But the interesting questions that I use are the ones about what happened at the moment of the arrest. I have to mention that these questions were implemented first by my sister, Ana Laura Magaloni, who is also a lawyer, and she designed the first questions that were implemented in 6 federal prisons. And then those questions were taken by the Statistical Office in Mexico, and now we fortunately have 2 rounds of surveys of the entire prison population in Mexico that allows me to document with very precise instruments what has happened. So just to give you a sense of the brutality of the system, here we ask whether people have suffered beatings with objects, crushed with heavy objects, suffocated or drowned, electric shocks, burn, stab, whether they have been threatened with false charges or harm in family, held incommunicado, stripped, tied, or blindfolded. And then whether that happened before they arrived to the public minister. Normally that would be the time when the preventive police arrests a suspect, and at the time when they are before the public minister, and normally the investigative police is already in charge of the process. And as you can see, there is very significant report of maltreatment during these moments. So with this data, we created 3 measures, one which we call institutionalized torture, and this includes harms such as electrocution, drowning, suffocation, asphyxiation, stabbing, crushing with heavy objects, and burns. And the reason we call it institutionalized torture is because we believe that there has to be some institutional endorsement to make this possible. There has to be a place where police have access to these instruments to be able to torture criminals. Then brute force, which means beatings and beatings with objects, and finally threats, which are very common against the family. So the data here this is 80%, and this is 40%, and it just shows from 1990, the beginning of the 19th until 2016, when this data was collected, how this is institutionalized torture went from around 80%, then this is the moment Mexico transitioned to democracy in 2000, and we start seeing a slight reduction of torture. And then the drug war begins. This is the second line. We see a sharp increase in torture. And then this is the dashed line that indicates when the reform was first started to be implemented in the States. So obviously this is only descriptive data, and to be able to causally identify how much the reform shaped torture, we had to do a lot of statistical work. And so one of the things we did, we looked at the way Mexico is a federal system. So the Constitution adopted this reform, but each state had different moments of adoption, and they also chose how to adopt the reform. Some said, okay, we're going to adopt the reform first in these municipalities, then others said we're going to adopt the reform first for certain crimes, and others used a combination of the two. So we focus here exclusively on the states that said where they were going to initiate the reform. And then we know when a prisoner tells us when he was arrested or she was arrested and in which place. So in that case, we can know exactly if that prisoner was arrested after the reform was implemented in his municipality or before. And we also can know a lot of other things. We know, for example, I will show you when militarized intervention takes place, how prisoners were treated during the time of the arrest. And so just to give you a sense of how the data looks, those before the reform, this is the pre-reform era. So maybe I'm going to go now here on this side. The pre-reform era, we see abuses of 67% of brute force, 55% of institutional torture, and threats 54%. And after the reform, it decreases to 45%, 34%, and 45%. So there is a 20 percentage point reduction. And this is still not properly identified, but it suggests that the reduction is very important. Interestingly, we look at before democracy and after democracy, and the reductions are really very marginal. And this is local democracy, when the authoritarian regime lost power for the first time there. So in addition to the reform, we look at militarized interventions. Mexico, at that time, deployed the armed forces to 9 states, so we can know if a prisoner was arrested when the military was deployed. And we also constructed this massive data set on turf wars by year in every municipality in Mexico from 1991 to the present. So we can know if there has been a turf war, which is a massive increase in homicides in that place, what happens at the time of the arrest. And so the hypothesis is that torture is going to increase when there are turf wars. Police feel more threatened, population feels more threatened, and there is more support for harsh punishments in those places. Also, our hypothesis is that when the military are deployed, there is going to be more torture, but when the reform is implemented, there is going to be less torture. And so we do this statistical analysis. I'm not going to go in detail on that, but it's a way to really be able to identify the effects of both reform, turf wars, and military interventions. And basically, our findings are the following. We find that torture decreases by 22% as a result of the reform. This is a very significant reduction, but I still have to recognize that torture remains still a problem in Mexico, when we're still seeing that at least 35% of prisoners still report that they are being tortured. Torture increases by 17% as a result of military interventions, and it increases by 27% when there are turf wars. So the hypotheses that we had are validated with the data. And this is a new analysis that I've just implemented with the most recent prisoner survey. And what is really interesting is how the trials and the nature of the trials have changed. So the red line, here the red line, vertical red line, means when the reform was implemented. And here is the predicted values of when the judge is present before the reform. He is never present or she's never present. Reform comes in and the judge is present. So 2 things I want to highlight. The victims are now present during trials, but most importantly, prisoners are not behind bars anymore. They are now before the jury, and prisoners are not tied or handcuffed anymore. So the nature of the trials has changed. I must mention that there are still a lot of challenges in Mexico's criminal justice reform. We did some surveys of police officers, and there is limited acceptability of the reform. They think that it protects criminals too much, and this is worrisome. Investigative police in Mexico, unfortunately, have not developed capacity to investigate using scientific and forensic evidence. They really have this path dependence of using torture as a method of criminal investigation created very incapable investigative police. And so today there is a big challenge that Mexico confronts really huge violence threats with a police that is not capable of investigating. So we have very high levels of impunity, and also hundreds of thousands have disappeared in Mexico since since 2006, and police really are not capable of giving a response to these cases. I also conducted some new work on endorsement of torture among the mass public. I don't have time to talk about it, but there is very strong evidence, unfortunately, that the population in Mexico endorses torture, and they really have, they believe that judges must convict suspects regardless of whether police uses torture or not. So this is not a very good news, but I think there is significant progress as a result of the institutional reforms, and more progress that can still be done working alongside investigative police to help develop scientific methods. Now I'm going to go to Rio de Janeiro, where I have spent at least the last, until 2018, when the state turned to the right, and the police really were given permission to kill with a hit to the head policy. And I thought there was no longer the conditions for me to continue working alongside police. But before that, there was significant progress that I'm going to report here of all the work that we were able to do with community members of favela residents and also alongside police. So this is a picture of an officer getting ready to occupy Rocinha, which is one of the largest favelas in Rio. We actually were there when this happened. Just before the pacifying police units arrived, we were collecting interviews among the population. So a lot of the work that we did, I'm not going to be able to talk about it here, but focus on one of the studies that the jury highlighted, which has to do with body cameras. But to do that, I have to give you some context. Brazil is a country where there is massive police violence. One person is killed by the police every 9 minutes for an average of 160 deaths per day. And Rio's cops, where I worked, are the most violent of all Brazil's cops. At least they have killed close to 20,000 people from 2003 to 2019. Just in 2019, close to 2,000 people died at the hands of the police. And just to give you a context, in the US, in the entire country, there are around 1,000 killings by police every year. This is only the state of Rio, where we have, in 1 year, close to 2,000. So the scale of the problem is really very different, although in both countries worrisome, but here is really a very different context. So the military police in Rio, which is the police in charge of prevention, there is also another police that is called civil police that are in charge of investigations. I focus mostly on the military police, which are the ones that are really deployed to combat drug criminals. That's the way the police perceive their function, and especially in Rio's favelas that are poor, marginalized communities. Overwhelming majority of the population are black, and they have historically been targeted by police. Police killings are rarely investigated or sanctioned by superiors within the military police, by the civil police, or by the courts. This means that in reality, police have traditionally had a license to kill in Rio. There is also mass support to police vigilantism. This is a survey collected in all of Brazil, and it asks whether you agree with this phrase, a good criminal is a dead criminal. And I distinguish here between black, white, and pardo population, which is people of mixed race. And you can see that white population, around 54% agree with this phrase, which is another way of saying we support police vigilantism. Among blacks, this reduces to 44%, but still it's very large support. This is in a survey collected in Brazilian cities. I also did this analysis that shows that the more you fear crime, this index of fear in crime, the more you support police vigilantism. Interestingly, when you fear the police, you don't support police vigilantism. So fear of crime among the masses has also emboldened police officers to behave this way. And this is a list of a lot of the papers that I've written and projects that I did in Brazil. One of them analyzing what was a very important reform that introduced a community-oriented policing approach in Rio's favelas. That meant trying to demilitarize police. I conducted quasi-experimental evaluation of that policy, also collected hundreds of interviews with officers and residents, a survey of more than 5,000 residents of favelas, and we were able to demonstrate some of the benefits of the reform and also what were wrong with that reform. But importantly, I have to mention that scientifically we can prove that it reduced police violence by 45%. Looking at the difference between favelas that receive an UPP and favelas that did not. Then I worked on this paper assigning body cameras in the favela of Rocinha, because one of the key challenges the reform confronted, the community-oriented policing reform confronted, was that police officers were being abusive on the ground. A lot of reports that police torture residents, beat them, freeze them, treated them with disrespect, and that helped to undermine the legitimacy of the reform. So a question that we had was whether bringing police cameras in those settings could really benefit police-community relations. And we did this randomized control evaluation. Then I'm also analyzing this system that I won't have too much time to talk about it, that police, in the 1995, there was a policy that actually paid police officers a bonus to kill. And that was a policy that lasted for 3 years. It was very controversial, obviously produced a lot of human rights abuses and extrajudicial killings. And that was no longer in place, but the culture of violence remained. And in 2011, the state introduced the opposite system of incentives that paid police officers to reduce crime indicators and also to kill less. So we analyzed the impact of that policy using a very large data set on the number of bullets that police officers shoot every time they go into the streets. And we are able to show that there was a really massive reduction of violence thanks to the pay-for-performance system. And then I'm also analyzing with a survey of more than 5,000 officers how much their ideologies shape actual use of force. So I use the survey with the bullet data to understand how much individual factors are shaping police behavior. So I'm going to skip here to go to the results of the body camera. So this was in Rocinha. Surprisingly, Rocinha, it's 120,000 inhabitants, and that's the police office. So when we were collecting interviews, there are a lot of bullet holes there. Police really feel in the middle, they call of the wolf's mouth. It's very rudimentary, and they have very little support. So that's where we took the cameras. The Rocinha has, the cameras were randomized by shift. We've had around 8,500 shifts with 47 officers participating in the study, and the study lasted for a year from December 2015 to 2016 in Rocinha, as I mentioned. We started the study with a community survey, and we find very toxic community police relationships. So for example, 61 report fear of being killed by police, 39 distrust, 38 fear the police, 27 feel disrespected. So we gave them these words of positive words and negative words about police, and they mostly chose all negative words, right? In our qualitative interviews, we heard that they were slapped in the face, intimidated, hissed, frisked, and treated with respect, and obviously only 10% say they would resort to the police if they had a problem. So we analyzed 3 different forms of police behavior. One is reactive policing, which means responding to calls from the community to the operations center and sending dispatch in response to those calls. Others are called street requests. So people in the street can request the police to act. And so these are both reactive policing activities, but we also studied proactive activities, which means stop and searches and other encounters with civilians. So our expectation was that the cameras should reduce those proactive approaches that tend to be violent, because police have a lot of discretion. And the results of this randomized evaluation produce a really interesting and intriguing conclusion. One is that, yes, we found a significant reduction of 46%. So this is the calculations by odds ratio. So we have just to calculate the odds. It's 1 minus 0.54. That's the total activities that police did. So there was a massive reduction of general police activity. There was a massive reduction of proactive policing, but intriguingly and worrisome also of necessary police functions that mean police have to respond to what the community are asking for. And those reductions are in the range of 46%, 39, and 60%. We also studied gunshots. As you know, we have this data set. Unfortunately, fortunately for the people and the police who were operating at the time that we were working, there were few events involving lethal force, 27, but we know how many bullets they were used. And it's very interesting, suggestive, because we only have a very small number of events, that GPPs, these are the community-oriented policing unit within Rocinha. There was no single bullet thrown when the cameras were assigned, and all the bullets they used were 113 were when they did not have cameras. So there is suggestive evidence that they also were using less force, but statistically we cannot test this because of the few events. And finally, there is really a very interesting result that police also appear to receive less community aggression when they are using the cameras. So here we say the first says how many police are cursed, how many police are thrown water, thrown urine, thrown stones, verbal threats, and physical attacks. And when the study begins, for example, cursed, around 90% report that they are cursed by residents. At the end of the study, this reduces to 66. Also, thrown water starts in 80% and it reduces to 43%. So we find reductions. The dark line is at the beginning of the study, the gray line is in the middle, and the blue light line is at the end of the study. So you can see reductions in every single form of aggression toward police when police are using cameras. So the conclusions seem optimistic, but there was also some worrisome result. This graph shows how many police turn on the camera, and we see a significant decrease of police willingness to turn the cameras on as the study progresses. We had a lot of, and we anticipated this was going to happen when we began the study. The local commander, the study was endorsed by the higher level in the military police, but the local commander said, if you give cameras to my officers, literally, she said, they will not perform their jobs. So there was resistance on the part of supervisors and officers to the cameras. So we anticipated that, and we assigned two types of protocols. In one protocol, police had to have cameras on all the time. And in the other, we use the same protocol as it is used in the United States when police are asked to turn the cameras on when they approach a resident or they have an encounter. Unfortunately, the always-on mode at the middle of the study we had to abandon because there was very strong resistance on the part of police officers. So we need to explore why police refused or accepted turning on the cameras, and we are able to use the survey that we collected with police officers with the minutes that they recorded to see who is recording and who is not. So our conclusions are the following. Officers who report experiencing higher aggressions from community turn the camera more. Those officers who report having killed someone in the past or injured someone turn the camera less. So this is obviously worrisome. So an important limitation of body cameras is that they give too much freedom on police officers to turn them on and on. And I think this suggests that cameras might need to be activated from the main station, not by frontline officers. And this technology already exists. So thinking about places like Rio, Mexico, and other, I think everywhere where police have this freedom, I think that it has to be restrained so that actually the cameras are turned on without their will. Another limitation of the technology, as I mentioned, comes from supervisors. So one question is, why did supervisors didn't enforce the protocols more? And as I mentioned, local supervisors were not that on board. So in the middle of the study, we decided to assign cameras to supervisors as well, and that really changed behavior significantly. So it does suggest that this is also a potential, very interesting intervention. So I'm really going to be very quickly here on data that I'm very excited to show. It's about the use of ammunition. And this just shows in the dark line in 2011, that's the third line that you will see from left to right. That's when the pay for performance system began, so when police started to be paid for not killing. And actually, the remunerations were quite significant. I don't have time to show that data, but you can see there was a really drastic reduction of use of force. And also, we observed the same with police killings. So less use of gunshots and less killings as a result of the pay for performance system. But then what happens? The economic recession comes to Rio in 2015. So you can see here, this is, oh, sorry about that. These are the number of police killings from 2004 to 2019. And you can see 2008 is when the community-oriented policing approach began to be implemented. And you see like drastic reduction of police violence there. 2011 is when this pay-for-performance system was implemented, and violence continues to reduce. But then the economic crisis comes, and actually the state does not pay the bonuses for the police during that year, and the system starts losing credibility. And then in 2018, a new local governor comes to office, Wilson, that he literally gets in a helicopter with a machine gun himself and flies over a favela and starts shooting people from the favela. This was the governor who was elected in 2018, and at that moment we decided there was no longer conditions for us to continue working in partnership with the police. So Brazil now has turned to the left. There is a change also in local government. Maybe conditions will change. But I think that all the work that I have shown you suggests that there were a lot of interventions done and effectively evaluated that were having an impact in reducing police violence. Unfortunately, obviously, politics gets in between, and especially when this type of governors get elected. Security policies changed significantly, and police were given again a license to kill in Rio. So my concluding remarks are going to be short, but my research in both countries reveals that militarized security interventions sharply increase human rights abuses, including torture and excessive use of lethal force, without reducing violence and often increasing it. These interventions also reduce the legitimacy of the state and police forces and can even bolster popular support for criminal groups. So in one of the favelas, we did a lot of interviews, one in Complexo do Alemán, which has around 400 inhabitants. There is a complex of favelas. One resident tells us, we won't get rid of a bandit, talking about drug traffickers, to endorse a new bandit, talking about police. So this is the way that they actually, in that setting, they preferred, unfortunately, criminals because their relationship with police had been very toxic through the years. A democracy without a strong judicial system to uphold due process risks restoring to autocratic-style police abuses, especially when faced with violent threats from criminal groups and also from terrorists. There is work showing that democracies resort to torture when they are threatened by terrorists. Hence, we need strong judiciaries that have to check on police behavior and guard due process to constrain abuse. And this is what the Mexico case shows by putting more constraints on police. Lastly, creating more humane and equitable police does require security policies that be made on the basis of science and evidence. This requires collaboration between police agencies and researchers. It's often very hard to obtain this data, and if police do not engage with the researchers, then we're never going to really gain knowledge that is scientific, that can tell us what works. But obviously, as I mentioned, politics can get on the way, and especially where citizens fear crime and criminal organizations, like in Rio, take control of minoritized communities. This is just to conclude, that's the type of cooperation that we were having with the police. This is the bullet data, and we were able to track every single police officer of 40,000, around 40,000 individuals in Rio, and we could tell how much they were shooting and whether they were shooting in excess of the regular, sort of a mean value. I presented this information before 300 police commanders in Rio, and it led to the firing of 20 officers and also to the creation of a retraining course that we were evaluating. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, this unraveled with the election of Wilson in Brazil. But had we been able to continue with this work, I think there would have been, with cameras, more monitoring, more checks on police, significant progress. So I want to thank every one of you for being here and for listening to my talk. And again, I appreciate so much the jury for recognizing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Magaloni. I invite you to return at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning for the Jerry Lee lecture on experimental criminology. It would be the first time that we've had an experiment in the prize winner's address, as well as the experimental lecture. So thank you all for coming, and see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you.